He sold his own kingdom to march on Jerusalem. Kings feared him, and one enemy came to respect him, Richard the Lionheart. The summer of 1191. Under a burning sun, an English king throws himself into the bloodiest siege of the age, storming the walls of Acre in the Holy Land. This is Richard the Lionheart, a giant of a man who sold his own kingdom for this war, and who kings across Europe feared more than any other. He was born a Prince of England in 1157, but he was no gentle royal. From boyhood, Richard was a warrior, happier in armor on a battlefield than on any throne. He grew into a giant, well over 6 feet, with reddish gold hair and a temper to match. Men followed him because he feared nothing, and led every charge himself. But his own family tore itself apart. Richard took up arms against his own father, the old king, fighting him openly for power and land. When the old king died in 1189, Richard finally took the crown of England. Yet he cared for but one thing only, the Holy Land. He had taken the cross, vowing to win back Jerusalem from the great Muslim leader Saladin. Nothing else would satisfy him. To pay for it, Richard emptied England, selling castles, towns, and titles to anyone who could pay, stripping his own kingdom bare for war. In 1190, he sailed at last, leading a vast Crusader fleet south across the sea toward the Holy Land and the war of his life. But the road to Jerusalem ran through blood long before he reached it, and Richard would leave a trail of conquered cities in his wake. On the way, he seized Sicily by force, crushing a local king who had wronged his sister and left the whole island trembling before him. Then, in 1191, he stormed the island of Cyprus, conquering it in weeks. On Cyprus, he also married his queen, Berengaria of Navarre. With Cyprus taken, Richard finally reached the Holy Land and the brutal siege of Acre, where Crusaders had been dying outside the walls for 2 long years. His arrival changed everything. The Lionheart drove the siege forward with terrifying energy, and within weeks the great city of Acre finally fell. But victory came with a dark stain. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were held for a ransom that never came, and Richard made a cold, merciless decision about their fate. The killing of the prisoners shocked even his own age. To Saladin, it made Richard both a man to be feared and an enemy to be answered. Now, the 2 greatest warriors of the age faced each other. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the brilliant sultan who had united the Muslim world. They never once met in person. Yet across the battlefield grew a strange respect. 2 enemies who each recognized the greatness in the other. When Richard fell sick with fever, Saladin sent him fruit chilled with mountain snow. When Richard's horse was killed, Saladin sent him 2 fresh war horses. But respect did not stop the war. Richard marched his army south along the coast toward Jerusalem, with Saladin shadowing his every step. At Arsuf, Saladin struck. He threw his whole army at the Crusader column, raining arrows down to break Richard's disciplined march. Richard held his men back until the perfect moment, then unleashed a devastating charge. The Lionheart shattered Saladin's army and won a famous victory. Arsuf made Richard a legend across the world. He had beaten the unbeatable Saladin in open battle, and the road to Jerusalem now lay open before him. But taking the holy city was one thing. Holding it deep in enemy land with a shrinking army was another, and Richard knew it. Twice he marched toward Jerusalem, and twice he was forced to turn back by winter storms, supply lines, and the brutal truth of the numbers against him. They say that when the holy city came into view, Richard raised his shield before his own eyes, unwilling to look upon a Jerusalem he could not take. It broke something in him, the whole war, the whole crusade, everything he had bled for, and the prize itself lay just beyond his reach in the hills. So Richard did the hardest thing of all. Instead of throwing his men away on a doomed siege, he chose to make peace with Saladin. In 1192, the 2 enemies struck a truce. Jerusalem stayed in Saladin's hands, but Christian pilgrims won the right to visit the holy city in peace. Richard never entered Jerusalem. His crusade was over, unfinished, and now the exhausted king turned at last toward home and England. But the sea betrayed him. Storms wrecked his voyage and forced Richard ashore in enemy territory, deep in the heart of hostile Europe. Disguised as a common traveler, the most famous king in the world tried to slip home in secret, and was recognized and seized. Richard the Lionheart, conqueror of Acre and Cyprus, was thrown into a cold Austrian castle and held prisoner by his own Christian rivals. They demanded a ransom so vast it could buy a kingdom. Back in England, the people were taxed to the bone to buy their king's freedom. While Richard rotted in a foreign cell, his own brother John plotted to steal his throne, hoping the Lionheart would never come home at all. For over a year, Richard sat in captivity, a lion in a cage, while all of Europe argued over his fate and his ransom price kept climbing higher. England bled silver to free him, churches gave up their gold, and the people paid crushing taxes, until at last the enormous ransom was raised. In 1194, Richard walked free and sailed home to England at last. His treacherous brother John fell to his knees, and the Lionheart, astonishingly, forgave him. But Richard barely rested. Within weeks, he crossed to France to win back the land stolen while he was in chains, and threw himself back into war. For 5 years, Richard fought across France, an unbeaten warlord, retaking castle after castle and building a mighty fortress to guard his kingdom. He seemed unstoppable, untouchable. But in the spring of 1199, at a small and unimportant castle, fate was waiting for the greatest warrior of the age. Richard rode beneath the walls of the little castle of Châlus, careless and unarmored, mocking the few defenders left inside. It was a fatal mistake. From the wall, a lone crossbowman took aim. A single bolt flew down and struck the king deep in the shoulder, the wound that would kill the Lionheart. At first, Richard laughed it off and tried to pull the bolt free himself, but the wound festered and dark rot spread through his body as the days passed. The bravest king in Christendom lay dying in a tent, brought down not in a great battle, but by one lucky shot from a nameless boy on a wall. As the castle fell, the crossbowman who shot him was dragged before the dying king. Everyone expected a cruel and terrible revenge. Instead, Richard forgave the young man and ordered him set free. It was the last great act of a complicated, violent, and extraordinary life. On the 6th of April, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died with his mother at his side, 41 years old, far from the England he had ruled for just 10 years. His heart was buried in Normandy, his body in France. The King of England chose to rest forever in the lands he loved and fought for. He had spent only 6 months of his reign in England and drained it dry for his wars. Yet he became the greatest hero England ever produced. The Lionheart never won Jerusalem, but his courage against Saladin turned him into a legend that has outlived kingdoms, echoing down 800 years. Today, his statue still stands guard outside the English Parliament, sword raised to the sky. The warrior king, forever frozen in his moment of glory. His name crossed the centuries into legend, woven even into the tales of Robin Hood, the noble king whose return every outlaw prayed for. Richard the Lionheart was a terrible king and a magnificent warrior, a man who gambled a kingdom on a holy dream and very nearly won. He feared nothing, bowed to no one, and earned the respect of his greatest enemy. Few men in history ever burnt so bright or so briefly. This was Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king who sold a kingdom for Jerusalem and became immortal in the trying. His name outlived his kingdom. 800 years later, Richard the Lionheart is still the warrior every child imagines when they picture a Crusader king riding to war. He took the cross as a young man, burning with faith, and led his knights across a burning world toward a dream that would consume his whole life. The castles he raised still stand, the legend he forged still lives, and his 3 golden lions still roar from the arms of England to this day. This was Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king who sold a kingdom for Jerusalem, feared by all, respected by his greatest enemy, and immortal in the trying. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more legendary stories from history's darkest and greatest figures.